All right, hello everybody. We're going to wait a couple minutes. We're not going to wait 3 this time. I have no anecdotes today to tell, and then we're going to get going. We've got 5 people, which means we've got to not waste time this time. That's it. Actually, maybe I should come up with anecdotes. And you guys got a joke for 1 or 2 minutes? Any of you 5? Or you 4?
No.
Oh, come on. No jokes.
No jokes. No joke.
This isn't a
For
fun
engineers.
Not a funny.
For engineers, what kind of joke do you want? I mean, come on.
My best laugh line, John, is usually "I worked for Enron." How's that? All right, so it works.
And I'm here to help you.
Yeah, I'm here to help you. I know everything.
Oh, look, it's 10:02. I guess we can start. So, all right, well, we'll start. Whatever. Okay, we'll start. It's 10:02. That was a quick 2 minutes. I guess that was one. So I'm just going to give a quick outline of what we're going to do, and then describe the topic, and then we'll get to it. So the way we're going to handle this is we're going to do introduction. I'm going to describe the problem for about 3 minutes. We'll do introductions very briefly, and then each of us is going to speak for 5 minutes, explaining how they think they would handle the topic at hand, which I'll describe in a minute. And then for about 15 minutes or so, we're just going to have a free-for-all. Anyone wants to talk and tell the other guys that they're right or wrong, or they agree or they disagree, we'll hear about that. And then in the end, for 2 minutes, we'll have our final statements. That's about it. That's how we're going to go about it. So I guess I'll explain the topic. So I've been teaching, let's say, software for about, I don't know, 20-something years, since 1998, I think, or maybe it's 97, I don't remember. And so when you do option C, you have utility bills, or at least that's how we've been doing it, for all this time. You have 12 bills or so, and you do these regressions. And in the old days, we would look at the R-squared value and say, yeah, the R-squared is above 0.75. It's a good regression. We're good. And then later on, folks were saying, like ASHRAE brought this up, actually not much later than 19, whenever I started, 98 or whatever. ASHRAE, said, no, you should be looking at CVRMSC. So we have that in the software. And if you have a good CVRMSC, then it's a good enough fit. And so there was these statistical indicators that said your fit is good enough. But the question was, what do you do if your fit is not good enough? What do you do? And I was taught by the person that wrote the software is Robert Sondriger, and he said, just use the base year bills. That would be your fit. Use the base year bills. And so that's what I taught. And I've been teaching that for years. I think that's what the ESCOs have been doing. And I saw that the IPMVP actually mentioned that your base year model can be just the 12 bills. You don't have to do a regression. So but the question is, well, what if you have your 12 bills, you try to do a regression model, and your CVRMSC is a little high. Maybe it's 35% or 40%, and and if you are looking at R-squared, well, that's a little low. Maybe it's only 0.6, but you can see an obvious trend, but the indicators aren't good. What do you do? And so I mentioned one thing. What we said was we could look at the old bills and use those, but ASHRAE doesn't really talk about it as far as I know. I don't think they even mention that case. What do you do? And it just barely kind of mentioned IPMVP and core concepts. So I wanted to hear what these folks had to say. I think we're going to have different ideas. That's my quick explanation of the problem. And I guess hey, Tyler, you're supposed to be doing this show here. Can you take over?
Oh, you're doing great, John. Brian, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, that's right. You're supposed to be doing introductions right now. That's what we're doing.
It's okay, John. We'll carry you. Don't worry. I'm Brian Klippinger. I'm the Director of Measurement and Verification for Energy Systems Group, or ESG. I've been doing this a really, really long time. And once you get past 20, 25 years in an industry, we like to say we're experienced. And old just sounds horrible, so we'll stay with experienced here. My perspective on this topic is through the lens of performance contracting. We're part of an ESCO. So we don't verify savings of ECMs to meet a standard or to meet some type of government or corporate initiative. We verify savings to meet a guarantee or a contractual obligation of our guaranteed savings. It's kind of a unique perspective because how we approach this is due to the nature of the guarantee. And so we care about the outcome a little differently than someone that's just an engineer that's just coming up with a model. So I really look forward to hearing from everybody today. There's a lot more smarter people in this room than me, so I welcome it, and let's let the debate begin.
You're up, Vince.
My turn. Hello, Vincent LeMoine. Thanks for having me. If Brian, is years in the industry, this specific industry, was it 25 years? Anyway, I only have about 18 months in this industry directly. So that makes me the most inexperienced. My background is from the math and statistics, and currently I am working as a data science manager at LyondellBassell in the petrochemical industry, primarily focused on manufacturing, optimization, but also running a lot of statistical projects one-off, so including designs of experiments, all kinds of statistical modeling, regression, classifications, lots of different things. But so my perspective on this, even though I was very well trained by Mr. John on the board here, very well trained many years ago, and have retained all that knowledge, I'm hoping to bring a perspective just kind of a little bit more on a different side, and I look forward to hearing everybody's conversation regarding this. So thanks for having me.
You're up, Steve.
Yeah, hi, Steve Kromer. Where's my prompt for this? Okay, yeah, I'm a registered mechanical engineer, professional engineer in Berkeley, California. I've been doing this for like 20 years. I worked for Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and I worked for Enron before that. And basically implementing teaching M&V under two flags. One of them Steve Kromer, energy engineer, and the other is counterfactual designs. So about 30 years ago, I was working at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and I was assigned the task of developing standard methods for doing M&V for the FEMP program. The FEMP program at that point was just authorized to initiate performance contracting across the federal sector. So they needed something to support that contracting capability to come up with quantifying the impacts. That effort precipitated IPMVP. It was parallel with what was going on with ASHRAE. So ever since then, I've been involved in one way or another in those committees. And I'm currently the chair of the CMVP, which is AE's certification body. And I teach around the world. So to support that program, actually, AE, I just wrote a book. So I get to advertise. It's called The Role of the M&V Professional. And my perspective is that the M&V professional has to take all the tools in the toolbox and look at them and think about them. And one of the best and most important is communicating with everyone else in their food chain with the goal of having successful settlement. So whatever it takes to get money exchanged at the end of the deal, that's the real goal of M&V. So I also look forward to having this discussion.
All right, you're up, Marco.
Hi, I'm Marco Clerx. I'm with Honeywell, so similar to Brian, I work with a company in ESCO, and I work with the M&V side. My portfolio probably has the largest number of Option C audits in all of Honeywell. One thing I have to say as a disclaimer, as I'm representing myself, so my opinions are my own and not necessarily those of Honeywell. I've also been in the industry for almost 30 years here, so this will be a fun time.
I guess it's myself. So my name's John Avina. I'm the owner of Abraxas. I don't know how to explain this. I've been teaching, providing tech support, and writing part of and managing the writing of Option C software, Option C M&V software. And I've been doing this for 25 years or so, maybe 23. I don't know the number. And that's about it. I've trained probably almost 2,000 people, I think. I don't know, 1,500, 2,000. I think it's close to 2,000. And yeah, that's it. But I've been in M&V, but mostly in option C for 20 something years.
We'll let the debate begin. Brian, why don't you take it away? 5 minutes and tell us where you're at.
All right. I don't know whether it's a blessing or a curse to go first with this group, so I'll just kick it off. You know, when I think of this problem, I think of, you know, what is the end game? You know, I myself and probably Marco, we're trying to prove our customers that the savings we projected or we promised actually occur. So when we do an option C or we do a regression analysis, you know, what's behind that? And it's typically because either one, we have to, either through stipulations of the agreement that we have, or the other thing is whether it's a complex ECMs or interaction between multiple ECMs, or just lots of savings within a single building or a meter. So what do we do when the tuning is bad or the statistics don't add up? You know, John taught us all. I mean, John's probably taught 80-90% of the industry that, you know, the R squared and the CV are the two main things that we look at. But what happens when they're, you know, out of bounds? You know, what do we do? Well, we have a couple stats guys in the group with Steve and Vincent, but I'm an engineer, and that's kind of the way I approach this, is that, you know, I look at the problem and I try to solve it from that problem. And so the first thing that I'm going to look at is the load profile. You know, is there a high base load? Because typically when you have a regression equation or a regression model, if you have a high base load, it can tend to have a low R squared, just because of the tendency of how that other variable is impacting the utility. You know, the other thing is it weather related, or what's the variable that's causing the consumption to change? So in most cases, we use weather in our projects, but there could be occupancy, there could be, you know, widgets that are being created. There's lots of other variables that can be added to it. But if the model doesn't work and we can't, and adding different variables doesn't help, then what do we do? The other thing we look at is, you know, are the bills from a normal year? When I say normal, I mean, is that data reliable? Is it accurate? And is it repeatable? You'll hear me say repeatable several times, because, you know, we're trying to show that after we install energy conservation measures, what it actually does to the bill. And if we can't have a good correlation on that model, then it may not show exactly that our implemented ECMs are actually doing what they're supposed to. One thing that we look at from the bills is that are there any estimated bills? I mean, we're typically usually talking 12 bills. So if we have estimated bills or we had a bad meter read, those can all cause variances in the model that you need to address. One thing that I know a couple people think that, you know, you should go more than 12 months, maybe go 24 or 36 months on a regression. I tend to not like that, because then you're kind of mixing a bunch of things that can happen. You know, getting that repeatable and normal year is hard enough in some cases. So when you blend that with 24 months of bills or 36, I think it can cause problems. The other thing is that typically we look at the last or the most recent year. Well, as we found out with the pandemic, the most recent year may not be the right one, because it's not a normal year. It's not a repeatable year. So we look at those sorts of things. And then, of course, you look at the key factors that are impacting or affecting the energy consumption. Is it human behavior? Is it conditioned space? Is it, like I said, are you making widgets? Is it making production? What are the things that are impacting that from a key factor? And then lastly is really the operation of the building. I mentioned the pandemic, and one thing that's changed a lot is the use of outside air. Well, from an engineer standpoint or from an HVAC person, you want to minimize the outside air for energy conservation, but for the health of a building, you want more outside air. So that causes a dilemma now on how much outside air comes into a facility. The other thing is simultaneous heating and cooling. That throws things off because it doesn't make it match heating degree days or cooling degree days. So those are some things that you can look at. So you can dig into that data. One thing that we like to do is, okay, now that we understand what's going on, what are the next steps? Well, for me as an engineer, it's about getting into the field. I'm not a numbers guy. I'm not a stats. I'm not looking at that. So the first thing I'm going to do is go out in the field and verify things. So you look at the building. You look, are there any sub-meters? Or is there any data logging capability that you can have to verify all those assumptions that you've put into the model? Because again, I think our job is very hard when you take a snapshot in time of a building. You go back and you look at the utility data for 12, 24, 36 months, and you try to extrapolate what that building has been going on from that site visit and then looking at the utility bills. And I think it's very difficult to do that in some cases. Again, apply some sub-meters if you can. If you can do that, that helps. Add data loggers, confirm occupancy, all those kinds of things you need to verify. And then again, make sure that baseline, and the boundaries that we're putting around the option C project, that they're repeatable and they're typical. So
All right,
those
Brian,
are the things.
we're gonna pause you because we're cutting into Vincent's time, and I think we're probably gonna run long on this. So hopefully we can go over an hour and everybody likes it. But Vincent, take it away, and we'll open it up for the 15 minutes or the 10 minutes that we have for the group discussion. Go ahead.
Excellent, thanks. So Brian said a lot of things. I'm not going to repeat, and so I'll just kind of talk from the modeling perspective, I guess. With, let's say, the purpose, right? The purpose of this is a couple things. Is what's the business purpose? Establishing a baseline, a true representation of Brian mentioned a normal year, a baseline year, historical, and there's a lot of variables that go into that. He mentioned, in my experience, what I have seen regarding this was heating days, cooling days, and that's pretty much the only data we had other than the utility bills and the so weather and the utility. So that, and then the buildings I saw were universities, were event centers, and so occupancy would spike on one days and be practically zero on others. So, and then there's also the biggest factor that I saw, because I did work for what we did was the actual providing service along with retrofits and new construction, new equipment to go in. But as far as the modeling goes, one is trying to take in fact the weather. Where I lived in the South, a lot of electricity and heating, and it could fluctuate. Some years the cold fronts were way longer, and it could change. I'm in Louisiana, is where I was at the time, and so the weather can be very crazy. But the whole thing is, if you're missing, if you have a bad fit, which I saw quite a bit, the question is, from the modeling perspective, is if you examine, like we look at R squared, right? If we use that, just kind of an understanding is, it's the amount of variation in the response that can be explained by the amount of variation in the explanatory variables. And so it doesn't mean that the model sucks, the model is bad per se. I'm being very relaxed here. It just means that we're not accounting for all the variation. And so we look at the data points, and so if you have bad data, if you have and vice versa, is, let's say you have a very good fit, but you look at the data and you could have leverage points and influential things. So one point, if you're looking at just monthly data, 12 days, 12 values to try to build this regression model, all it takes is one value to kind of mess things up. So do you bill match? Do you run with a bad model? And so, as far as statistically speaking, with a high MSE and all these things, so the question, the point I would say is you're establishing that baseline. So whether you go with both, sometimes I would consider a hybrid or a mix, not mathematically, not trying to splice it together, but offering kind of two, the bill match and offering the full fit model and trying to capture. So the whole thing is just to remember is as we get our performance increases, can we, not reestablish a baseline? We don't want to do that. We want to keep that baseline before we make physical improvements to the building or the operation. But how are things improving? So I'm kind of rambling here, but the point I'm trying to make is it's very important to just remember that if you have bad or low R-squared values, or you have high MSE, you have errors that are very big. What really is going on there? And so you have to make that decision. Do I run with a model, a model that's only capturing some of the variation? And like to Brian's point, can I kind of indicate? Can I kind of document other variables that aren't necessarily building into the model, but we know are happening? So I would say I would be okay with that. And even the work I do today is sometimes you have a bad model, but if you plot it, you look at it, you can kind of go off from there and you can make decisions later on how to improve. So maybe I'll come back to this a little bit more during the open debate, but I'll save a few seconds and pass it on.
Perfect. Thank you, Vince. Kromer, Steve.
Yeah, hi, thanks. And thanks to the first two. I heard a message that I actually gets to my key point, which is that there's a lot of judgment involved in a situation where the data that's presented to you, which you don't have any choice over, really. We heard some about maybe I can pick 3 months or 3 years or whatever, but there are some judgments there about how much time you use, but you get the data you get from the facility you're looking at with option C, with the whole facility. And the goal is always M&V successful settlement, which just means that the parties involved can see this problem, this challenge, and if they don't get a match, they can collectively and cooperatively work out a solution. So I'm always this pitching. It's M&V is where reasonable people agree. So that's why I teach and try and develop a whole community of practice that understands these challenges and doesn't try and hold some sort of perfection like a hammer over your head. Like if you don't get it, you can't use it. So that's, I think, where John and I are in agreement. But let's go back a little bit to John's, I think, the point he raised when he developed this thing, which was, where do we go for instruction on this topic? If we just leave it up for judgment among the parties involved, that's great. But a lot of times people want to say, well, what's the right way to do it? And John said, well, people will open up on some of these documents, one of which is the IPMVP. Okay, what's that? Well, this is where maybe we can have a debate, because I don't see IPMVP from experience as having been developed as a requirements document. IPMVP was developed as a set of guidance principles and terminology to address a general set of problems, including how you take whole building data or individual machine data, equipment data, stuff like that. And what we tried to do in IPMVP was come up with a logical framework to have discussions among reasonable people. They would develop individual M&V plans for their site, understanding all the challenges. That required both sides to have equal information. So ASHRAE was not a requirements document. IPMVP was not, though it sometimes gets construed as such. Like, what does IPMVP say? Well, it should just say, there are challenges here. There's a sum of them, and there's a thing called R-squared. Learn about it, but it's not always good. All right, you move on to ASHRAE. ASHRAE is a requirements document. ASHRAE lives in the world of standards. It's not a standard, but it's a guideline that's as close. So what do you do? Well, there is language in there, John, in ASHRAE 14, guideline 14, that sometimes you can't get a model to work. CVRMSE is too high, R-squared is too low. Savings are not. You didn't mention fractional savings uncertainty, but that's the whole thing. Really, the function of the uncertainty of the model is a function of how much savings you expect to see as well. So if you have a large amount of savings potential, you can live with a higher CVRMSE. And there's a direct relationship between CVRMSE and RMSE, which is the underlying uncertainty in the model itself. Okay, not to get into details, but the point there is that ASHRAE is a guidance document and gives you clear goals and hurdles you have to meet if you want to claim you're complying with. Again, I make this really clear distinction, at least in my own mind. IPMVP, you can't really comply with it except to use the language properly. ASHRAE has specific procedural compliance things. The third one, for those of you in the world of FEMP, I think it's interesting to note that when FEMP, a Federal Energy Management Program, developed their contractual stuff, M&V was developed to directly integrate with that. So more or less, there also are requirements there. They're maybe not so perfectly laid out, but those are 3 different documents that you'll look to for guidance. And you shouldn't look to IPMVP for tell you exactly what the threshold should be, just guidance on how to do the stuff. Historically, I was at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and when I was asked to help create the protocol generally, and I looked at option C, whole building, and I looked at our buildings at the lab here. John, we don't have a lot of weather in Berkeley, and we don't have hot summers and cold winters, and none of our buildings would create a good model, right? I mean, we just couldn't get correlations. In fact, we have correlations that correlate time of day of people coming in, hourly correlations, but not the weather itself. So they're more occupancy based. And that's why we we threw options A and B in the protocols to say there are many situations where even the data you have is not sufficient. That's only half the problem. The other half of the problem with option C, which we haven't mentioned, is the non-routine events, which all the things that happen after you've got the data and you have no idea how they would have impacted the core baseline data. So those are 2 reasons why option C, from my perspective, was never really a choice in most of my projects. And I didn't see it for a lot of projects in the federal sector either. Okay, let's just go a little bit more into what this whole thing's about. So M&V collectively.
I'm going to wrap it up, Steve. I'm going to pass it off to Marco.
Okay.
That's 5 minutes right there.
Okay.
Open this up in a little bit.
Wow. Okay.
All right, sorry, Steve. All right,
No,
so I'm gonna cover just something really high level, then some options. Why do we have poor baselines, and maybe what to do? So, if any of my staff is out there, take notes because there'll be a test on this. So one of the things I always think about or try to remember is PGA: practical, graphical, and analytical. Because statistics is not just about the analytical numbers. And I've added something to that: stories. People like stories. If you can explain it with a story, they'll buy it, even if it's not exactly mathematically true. So building on that, I said, okay, so if you have a poor fit, what are you going to do? Well, there's 5 they're not mutually exclusive options. One is you're going to use the bad fit as is, and you just go with it. One is you artificially modify the fit with some other kind of information. You've heard people say you might expand from 1 year to 3 years, but you might have a bad fit after exploration because the utility bill data you got was estimated reads, and you might want to redefine how those estimated numbers are, and you get a better fit. There's the one that we all know, bill match, as we say in metrics, or option C. That's just use the data as is without any modification. In my experience, though, another option, sort of an option is I adjust contract language to be able to do not just a baseline adjustment, but a wholesale future change in my baseline. If for some reason in the future it's discovered that a whole meter was missed, or somebody all of a sudden remembers why the building did something, and that's why you had the bad regression. To build on what Steve was just saying about option A or RIM versus option C, we do these regressions usually in option C, but I tell everybody that doesn't mean you're not doing a RIM or option A also. So ESCO, we have a whole large guarantee. we put in some ECMs that are inside this boundary, and yet we're looking at this meter that covers this boundary. Everything between this and this is a problem. So it's not only change over time, but change between those two boundaries. And that's why I think you should still do some kind of measurement, pre and post retrofit, some short-term trending on your ECMs to make sure that you can prove that your ECM is working, even though your option C may say, you know, it may not have good certainty. One of the things that we ask ourselves is, you know, why do we have this poor baseline? I'll tell you, one of the main reasons we see is if the building in the baseline period is not in some kind of control. By that I mean a decent building management system that's actually operating with respect to weather. If it's all manually operated by some custodial person, and don't get me wrong, I've had one job where the baseline used a lot less energy than post retrofit after we automated everything because this guy controlled it so tight. So buildings with poor control sequences, any kind of capital work that's happening during the baseline period, and one of the ones that Steve just mentioned, you know, your building really doesn't correlate to weather. It's the loads are strongly driven by either process loads or driven by occupancy. Okay, so that one about the building being in control or not in control, and add that to the option where I said adjust your contract in the future. There, you know, what to do when you have a bad baseline. If you pick one of those 5 options, or you combine them together. But what we've often done is in the first year, regress your building, and then use that to compare to future years. You know, so you can see if there's some kind of creep, things like that. We do look at extra years. So use the 1 year maybe as a training period in your baseline, but then use your other years out before the install start as your test period. Yeah, I'll just leave that. I'll leave it at that for now until we discuss more.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. So I think we got about, I'll say 12 minutes, but you can probably go 15.
Wait, it's my turn. I got 5 minutes too.
Well, that's right. I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
Okay. All right.
Most
So
important.
first off, I know that everyone was assuming this, but we're assuming in all cases that the mean bias error is going to be 0. What I mean by that, and I think everybody's already assumed that, but what that means is if you took the 12 bills that you did your regression on, you add them up, and then you took the 12, what the model predicted the 12 bills would be, added those up and did a % difference, it should be about 0. And I think that we all pretty much agree on that. And that's so that's we're not questioning that. That is models will have that. If it has a really lousy mean bias error, it's a bad model. That's all there is to it. I don't think you should use it. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about CVRMSE and R squared, and whether the fit is, you know, kind of goes through the bills or not. Okay, so the other day, actually, I think it was yesterday, no, 2 days ago, I did a regression. I was looking at NASDAQ monthly closes, and I was able to get a good regression versus NASDAQ monthly closes versus Steam actually it's of a model from Brian that Brian once sent me, and I got a good fit. So you can get a good fit with a good R squared, a good CVRMSE, a good mean bias error, but it does not mean that it's going to be a good model for predicting future years. It does not mean that. So that's one thing. So if you do a fit, no matter what, I guess the other argument that always should apply is you should be able to tell a story that most people will believe you. In other words, I can't say, look at the great model. The R squared's good, the CVRMSE is good, the mean bias error is 0. This is a wonderful fit. This is my model. We're going to use this as my baseline for future years. That's not going to work. I can't explain that. It's like, what does the NASDAQ have to do with my steam usage? It has nothing to do with it. So no. So you have to be able to tell a believable story. All right. So again, what I taught in the past was we should what we call bill match, which basically means we use base year bills. You have a bad fit, you can't get a good regression, you have a little bit too much scatter, you just do this bill matching. And that is use the base year bills, and then that will be what my quote adjusted baseline is every year forward. Well, I mean, except for you're not really I guess you could adjust for number of days in the bill, in the billing periods, but that's what I have taught, and that's what a lot of folks have been doing for decades. And I don't think there's anything wrong in that, but there's an assumption, an implicit assumption that's made, which is the outliers that happen during that base year are going to happen every year that follows, and that may or may not be true. So let's pretend we approach this two ways. One, we took our bad model. Let's say we had an R-squared of 0.6 and we had a CVRMSE of, let's say, 40%. So it's not a very good model. There's a bit of scatter and whatever. And we looked at that, and then we also tried the bill match where we just took the bills, and we looked at the prior year of data and used those models to predict or compare against the prior year. I don't know if that's making sense. So let's say for my model, it's Y equals MX, or kilowatt hours equals bills times number of days plus cooling degree days times number of kilowatt hours per cooling degree day. And we applied that to the prior year of data, assuming we had it. So this is all before the retrofit went into place. And then we calculate the CVRMSE of that, of the difference between the predictions from the model and the actual bills there. And you calculate the CVRMSE of the bill match versus the actual bills for the year before, and see which one's worse. And I think that would tell you, is the bill match worse than the just using bills? I mean, that's making the assumption that the energy usage patterns are kind of the same from year to year. So that's a test I think you could do, but I think that you could actually, you don't even need to do that. I've done it, but you can just look at the bills. If you had 2 years of base year bills, you do the regression on this. My time's up, really? No. I didn't. No, okay, I didn't hear Tyler say anything, so I'm going to keep going. So you assume, so back to this, you have base year bills, you have your model, and you, so you find out where are my outliers? Let's say it's November, December. You look at the prior year, where are the outliers? Oh, they're November, December, same months. Okay, then you can assume that you're making an assumption based on just 2 years of data. It will always be November, December. That's how they used to use data. It was, am I okay, Tyler, or do I got to stop? I got to stop. Okay, I'll continue later. Too bad.
Yeah, I think we did okay, but we got about 10 minutes for open discussion, and then we'll wrap it up. So open discussion between you five, and then we'll go from there.
All right, I'll start right away because I didn't get to finish like everybody else, but I had to go first, so I was a guinea pig. But I can't stand bill match, by the way. And the reason why is because you're saying, going back to that typical year, you're saying that, oh, after I implement all these ECMs, the building's going to act the same. And I just think that's completely wrong in saying that. And so my point is that if you can't make it fit, why, square peg, round hole, do some other options. Marco gave some real good ideas, but if it doesn't work, don't make it fit and try something else. Because John, you are right. You have to be able to explain what you're doing. And when you're saying just throwing a dart and saying, yeah, we're going to match last year's bills, it's too hard. I just don't think it's relevant compared to how a building reacts after we do a retrofit.
All right, I'm going to add something anyway. So I kind of disagree. I think bill matching is actually pretty cool, but if you have these random outliers, if you compare from year to year, let's say you had that prior year and the outliers are not always November, December, they were one year and the other year they're February and April, then it's random. And then in that case, I think that maybe the bill matching, I agree, isn't the best. And I think that's the case where you would use a model.
And I think the problem with that,
lousy R-squared.
Yeah, the problem with that, John, is that we don't know what those outliers are until after the fact, when we can repeat it again for the next year. So then we're just kind of making stuff up.
These are both pre-retrofit years I'm looking at.
Okay.
So,
Can I jump in there for a sec? I don't know what the format is, but it's not the Republican debates, I guess.
Jump in when you
Yeah,
want.
well, so I hear it. This is like, again, my bringing people together, but I heard some of you, although I don't know what a RIM is, Marco, you use that acronym, but I don't know. But you know, in the world of M&V that I live in terms of teaching it within the CMVP, I also go to AEE, and we have the CEA and the CEM. So the equivalent, just energy, a lot of different energy managers. And these are the skills that go out to that facility, the hard boots on the ground. And Brian, I think you brought that up early. I know, Marco, you talked about it. You know, these are the other types of information you can bring to the game that you should be bringing to the game. You know, John, you know, if I was to be inflammatory, I'd say, you know, you spent too much time just looking at the data from your office. And I know that's not true because you went down to the Caribbean for a long time, you walked the plants, but three have to work together. M&V is not a single independent system. It's got to be in, the baseline is the audit, basically. So being more sophisticated about taking all the information in the audit and bringing that forward into the modeling is what we're talking about with reasonable people who can agree on these things. I'll just throw out there for the purpose of the debate. You know, Marco and I talked about a little bit the differences between causal inference. So in a scientific framework, what we did this, you know, we're doing an experiment. It's called longitudinal. We're testing ourselves against ourselves over time. The alternative is what? To compare yourself to a control. So, you know, in other areas around the world, in every other discipline, they're working on this very similar problem, and they call what we do synthetic controls, which just means the control is we're comparing ourselves to ourselves over time. So we can go right now to Google and go to causal inference, causal impact. The whole world of people that are trying to figure out how do you quantify the impact of efforts of activities on your operating system. And that's what we're trying to do.
I want to ask you, so you, outside of M&V world, you do regressions, and when you're doing your research or whatever you're doing where you do it, how do you determine what is a good fit? Because you probably have different, let's say, determiners of what is reasonable and acceptable and what is not. We in our industry have these numbers, but what about you from outside the industry?
So the two things I look at when I look at any kind of modeling is, do I want to be predictive, and also do I want to be, and do I need to be interpretable? And so right now, depending on the case, if I'm trying to figure out what is given the situation, right? Given this population, so I relate it to like a build the building. If everything in this situation is the current truth and nothing changes physically, then would I be able to predict consumption? Would I be able to predict energy uses, kilowatt hours going forward, given some input, right? Given something like that. When I look back at the model, what makes a good model is I always have to go back and look at the data, because you can have very bad R-squareds, you can have very good R-squareds, but the models suck, right? You have essentially like two different populations or something like this that you're trying to regress on, and you're not accounting for. There's something else you're missing. So the way to answer your question is, what makes a good model a good fit is, if I'm trying to be indicative, interpretable, excuse me, can I determine which variables are causing the impact, what is causing the impact and the change in the response? So what is accounting for that R square, right? If you want to think about it that way, the amount of variation and why, what's the biggest impact on that? If I'm looking at trying to be predictive, then does it really matter? How do I separate which variables, what's causing this, occupancy, weather, bad operations, things like that. But if I'm accounting for everything and I'm running like a training and a validation and all these things, can I repeat? Because that model always going to be repeatable, predictive, and that kind of deal. So it's a mix. It's just depending on the case. But and also comparing different types of approaches, right, John, is if you look at the reduction in some kind of criteria, not just increase in the R squared or just R squared, predictive R, all these things, but you look at MSC, AIC, BIC, you look at any of these other sometimes very non-parametric ways are looking at as well these statistics to look at how does one model improve over the other. So you establish your baseline model, whether that's an average, whether that's some type of linear regression, general linear model, bill matching, whatever the case may be, and you compare that to an improvement. How is it? Is there a reduction? Is there something like that? In things like that. So it just kind of depends.
Yeah, it depends. That's a quick summation. Thanks.
Yeah. Took a lot of time.
It was very good, especially when you were talking about repeatable models. And I think one of the issues we all have is we tend to look at this as a one-time event. Like we are talking about the baseline and we're going to regress it. And especially for ESCOs, you do a regression once and that's your model that you're going to compare the current year to and calculate your savings. But I don't know why we don't look past that and say, okay, it's not a great model. It's never going to be a great model, the static model in the past. And we move forward and do different tricks, like the one I said, where in year one regress again and then use that to compare year 2, 3, 4. At least you can tell against your post retrofit how you're performing. But also, and I thought John was going to go in this when he mentioned NASDAQ. I found that the people I hire that are most in tune just intuitively are the ones that play with stocks, that actually use like Thinkorswim or some of these other platforms. And I've always wondered why we don't do something like run exponential moving averages or like the Bollinger Bands, if anybody looked at that in terms of stock to see whether stock is overbought or oversold. Like use that going forward. It's an open loop, and all my staff is going to gasp because I'm big on closed loop systems. But it's the stock market's an open loop. You really don't have independent variables per se when you're looking at that kind of technical analysis. So I think we should probably be developing some of that. And I say that because you use that to help inform yourself to adjust your baseline that wasn't that great. Going forward, maybe we call it baseline adjustments, but that's why we do that stuff, to adjust the baseline because it wasn't that great.
Recently, I say recently, about a year ago. Go ahead.
Well, I'd like to jump on that point with Marco in terms of take this whole thing. John, you inherited with Sondreger's great work, and he was on the original ASHRAE committees. This specific approach, and it's satisfactory to some degree, except when it breaks down like we're talking about here. But it's not the only approach. Marco and I tend to disagree about whether Bayesian approaches are different. But one thing we haven't talked about is, and I know you rail on about it, John, is uncertainty analysis itself, which is what's the confidence interval within which you're doing that? And how do you calculate those, and what's that worth? Yeah, so now that's another good joke, I guess. That'd be a joke line. But the idea that we're stopping with like this frequentist methodology, which is take the data you have and then try and cram it into something that works. Okay, fine, if everyone agrees to that. But there's other worlds out there, and what Marco just mentioned is the whole time series analysis world. I mentioned causal inference, causal impact. There's lots of other people working on this. And if you again go back to your original question, if I keep it sort of simple, which is what does IPMVP or form per ASHRAE say about it? I'd say not enough. I'd say there's a lot more we could be saying. And Marco, that's why I started Counterfactual Designs, because I think there's so many other worlds of people and influence that can get into this, to answer these questions differently with more advanced technology. And everything, the whole idea about maintaining this idea that simple frequentist models are sufficient is just causing us this end, roadblock, whatever, dead end. There are models that we could be using.
Right, but the whole thing is with those models, right? Is to the effect is, I've written some models in the past. Recently, I did one where trying to basically hedging electricity pricing and things like this. instead of buying on spot at some of the plants, can I go 7 days or how many days ahead? And one of those things, the model worked until it didn't work, you know. So the whole thing is, and the problem is, I could never determine when it wasn't going to work anymore, and that was some other thing I wasn't capturing, or maybe just unexplained, completely unexplainable. Whereas when you run like something like regression, it is kind of right. The whole mentality is, you know, think of just look at a line, right? You know those populations, you know you're regressing Y on X. For any kind of value of X, you're going to get a predicted value of Y, and that is repeatable, interpretable, predictable, all these kinds of things. So, like to Steve's point, like, there's lots of different approaches, but you're going to trade things. Like, let's say you run with just some kind of run with an RNN, or, you know, CNN, something you like really blow it up here, or some kind of use some kind of classification, like some kind of tree method, you know, boosted tree or something like this. It's going to work as long as you see the data within there, but you throw something outside of it, it can go really bad very quickly. Or, you know, you show pictures of cats and dogs, you go to a bird, it's not gonna be like, what is it? So it's a great idea. It's just what's the contract, what's the documentation, what's the procedure? It's always a challenge, right?
Gentlemen, we're gonna do a wrap up here. You guys have been a great discussion. We've all gone over. I think this could be a 2-hour webinar. It's been killer. Let's go 1 minute to close it out. Say whatever you want, rebut somebody. 2 minutes, sorry. And Steve, why don't you take it first?
Sure, thanks. Well, thanks everyone for the discussion. And John, thanks for setting it up. You know, again, I'm just going to focus back on, to answer the question of how you deal with models that don't fit. You educate both parties as well as possible. You emphasize that everyone needs CMVP on their team, because the idea that there's a scientific answer that one party can get a hold of and the other party can't is wrong. What you always need to do is have people on both sides understand the challenge, understand the strengths and weaknesses of whatever model they pick. They're free to pick better models or different models. But really, it's all about educating the whole community. This is why these kind of meetings are great. Read my book and come to AEE next week if you want to learn more about what the whole community is doing to help advance this, because we are the accountants for energy management. And it's really important that we keep this relatively open, transparent, clear, and easy for people. So I appreciate you having this talk, John.
Thank you. All right, my turn. All right, so I just want to make a couple points. One is Steve was talking about some more, let's say, advanced and more difficult, let's just say advanced modeling and all of that. And I think, you know, if you want everyone on board, it's got to be kind of simple so that your clients could actually understand what you're doing. If it gets too complicated, they're not going to trust you anymore. And so that's number one. The other thing is what Brian and I think Marco were saying, and also Steve, is that, you know, you're just doing, and Steve said it really well. It's like, John, you're just looking at analytical stuff. You know, you're just sitting in your office looking at numbers, and you're not being with the building. Excellent point, Steve. But on the other hand, sometimes you are obligated. It's like, look, we have to do option C. That's what I have to do. That's what the contract says. That's what I have to do. And so then all you have are numbers. It doesn't matter if I know everything about the building. I could know everything about the building, but if I can't find a variable to make a better fit, what good is knowing anything about the building? I have this is the variable I have, this one and maybe this one, and I still don't have a good fit. What do I do? So I don't think that really knowing everything about the building necessarily is going to help. It helps sometimes, but I think sometimes not. Is that my 2 points? I'm done, right? Yeah, I'm done. Next. Vince, you're up.
Who's next?
It's me. So yeah, some great points. You know, in like to John's, everybody made some great talking points. What I always think back is, and I think John asked this question: how do I decide what's a good model? And so, if I step back from MMV and all these things, which I haven't lived in that world in a very long time, is at the end of it, what's the question I'm trying to answer? And so this one here, I would assume the assumption is to lower my electric bill, right? Let's just say make it super simple. That's the question I'm trying to answer. What can I do to lower this? Electrofits, capital projects, operate, all these things. And so the model, good, bad, whatever it is, whatever reason it is, that's just what we have to work with. I don't need to know if I don't know everything, all this stuff, that's just what it is. I have to make the most of it. Make the communication, establish that baseline with the assumptions. Because of this is what we have. What do we want to do? What's the question we answered? And then mark it from there. So again, in the world that I live in now, is good fits, great fits, all these things. It's just a tool for me to use to make a decision, for a person to make a decision. Do I change this? Do I do that? What's the impact? That kind of thing. So it's sometimes you have, sometimes you're just dealt the cards you're dealt with, and you have to try to win in whatever that definition of winning is. So I said a lot. I'll stop there. 30 seconds to the next one.
All right. Thanks again for putting this together. I think a couple of things that were mentioned were simple and easy to understand. Our customers, it's complex enough in what we do. When you make it more complex, I think it makes it more difficult. That repeatable. I get it. If the model doesn't work and you're stuck with doing an option C, to me as an M&V leader now, I have to take a risk assessment of what I'm going to do with that project. Because at that point in time, since I'm guaranteeing this outcome and it's going to be for 20, 25 years, I've got to really assess that and say, okay, do I need to pull back on my savings and say, I don't really trust what's going to happen. I don't trust what the customer is going to say when this is done. So now I'm going to have to pull back. So I think those are the things that you have to do as an industry. I agree with Steve. We need to continue to evolve, but again, the customers need to evolve with us, and that's very difficult. So to me, it's just a risk analysis at that standpoint. But thank you for everything.
Yeah, thank you for this. This is great. I think to summarize, I think of it from what I've heard as stories, context, and it's not set and forget. So we've all talked about, each of you, about the different stories that we have to come up with, in simplifying this to talk to our customers. It's not always just two parties, the customer and the ESCO. There's a lot of, there's the M&V person, the install person, the customer's consultant, the salesperson. There's a lot of hidden different agendas to address in this story. I think Brian mentioned about the context. So the second thing, context. So yeah, if it's a really bad fit, then we may not want to, we want to pull back on that savings number. Maybe we projected a large number and we're only going to guarantee half of that because it's a bad fit. Or it's bill match and it's only $2,000 a year of saving out of $1 million. I don't care, bill match it. So context matters. And then I think you already heard me say, it's not set and forget. We tend to just do this regression one time and our analytical stuff is done. And I think we can start developing maybe go forward regression tools, open-ended stuff like the stock market does. And maybe for Steve's benefit, when I hear myself talk about adding information to the original regression, maybe I'm a closet Bayesian. You just don't know it.
That's it.
All right. Hey, thanks everyone for coming.
All you gotta do is defend your priors.
My posterior.
Vince, Steve, Brian, Marco, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you guys being on this. This was a big experiment. We didn't know if this was going to be a disaster or success, or it's going to be somewhere in between, is what I figured. So thank you so much for coming. Quick thing, Marco, on my list of improvements for our software, our M&V software, I do have adding another, let's say, another regression capacity, so you can do one for year one. So you can not just do, a baseline and actual, but you can actually do year one, a regression for year one, and then compare that to later years also. And then you can see if there's, that's on the list. It hasn't done it yet, started, but that I hope to get next year. That should be done. Okay, that's it. Thanks everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
Thanks all.
Thanks, John, for having this. Bye. Thanks everyone. Nice meeting you.